Hi everyone, welcome back to Body Talk with Rachel, where I, along with the help of special guests, talk about body concerns among different groups. I'm Rachel, I'm a doctoral intern at the Counseling Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm really excited to be joined today by Dr. Jessica David. She also goes by JD, if you've heard that around campus. She's going to talk with me about body concerns among student athletes. So thanks so much for being here, JD. Would you like to first introduce yourself?
Sure, definitely. And thank you for this opportunity, Rachel. As Rachel shared, my name is Dr. Jessica David, also known to our Towson community as JD. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a staff psychologist in the Counseling Center, as well as the coordinator of student athlete mental health and performance.
Awesome. Thank you for introducing yourself. And
Absolutely.
I just share this note that we're going to have this conversation today about body concerns among student athletes. And we're going to be talking about general themes. So those who are watching, please keep in mind that there are some generalities being made. And unfortunately, our conversation will not be inclusive or representative of all experiences of student athletes. So keep that in mind as you're viewing. But to start us off, JD, I was hoping you could maybe just introduce us to maybe why body and eating concerns are maybe important to be considering among the student athlete population. What maybe are the risk factors that they might have for these body and eating concerns?
Sure. Yeah. So with this first question, just about specific risk factors or aspects of the student athlete experience that may place them at greater risk of experiencing body image concerns or disordered eating concerns, the first thing I like to go to is just highlighting the student athlete experience in general. When we're talking about student athletes, particularly at the Division I level, these individuals are, what I would like to say, they're essentially holding two full-time jobs. So if you think about the amount of energy, time, effort that goes into being an undergraduate college student, as well as all of the time and energy and effort that goes into, using your physical body to perform athletically at an elite level, that's a lot of stress.
It works
So
too, I'm sure.
absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of work, work that student athletes are often very passionate about, but a lot of stress. And I like to point that out to folks because that in and of itself, being a student athlete in some ways is a risk factor just because of the high levels of stress. And that's not to mention some of the other characteristics that we'll talk about in a second. So just again, keeping their experience in mind, that in and of itself places them at higher risk. But then we get into some of the nuances and some of the intersectional identities of student athletes. When I say intersectional identities, I'm thinking about sociocultural factors. What is the student athlete's cultural background in terms of, country of origin? It could also be family of origin, maybe some of the messages from a cultural perspective that they've received within, but also outside of their households. I also think about personal risk factors like, family health history, any trauma experiences, experiences associated with their peers, how have they been brought up socially. So when we look at all of these individual factors, these definitely play a role. Now, when we think, more broadly, I think it's important to note that there are a lot of elements of different sport experiences that can also play into higher instances of body image concerns and disordered eating. As you mentioned, Rachel will definitely be talking about some general information. So it's not, so when I think about other risk factors or other identities that can definitely put someone at greater risk, we know that body image concerns and disordered eating occurs at a higher frequency in female identified athletes, and thus women are at higher risk. But I also want to note that men and male identified athletes definitely represent a population of student athletes who experience body image concerns. And with men, I actually think that you have a lot of instances that are underreported. We know that for a fact, male students seek out help at lower rates than female identified students. We know that from a general counseling center perspective, but that's definitely true in terms of folks who are seeking out mental health services as far as the student athlete population as well. But again, acknowledging that female student athletes are at greater risk because we do see higher levels of frequency. When you think about again, some other differences that could play a role. Playing on an individual sport team as opposed to a team sports team. We also know that sports that emphasize appearance and or have weight requirements, look at muscularity and form in terms of its rating or judging requirements. Those sports can also present as higher risks. And I know we'll get into this a little bit more further, but there are definitely other elements of the sport experience in terms of uniforms that folks wear, how you're perceived, how you're coached, that can also play a role in just some of those groupings being at higher risk for eating disorders and body image concerns.
Yeah, it seems like there's a whole lot of factors that could really intermingle and increase someone's risks for eating
Absolutely.
and body concerns. You mentioned that there are sports that might have particular uniforms that might lead to greater risk for a body concern, as well as ones that might involve weight concerns. Are there any particular sports that come to mind that might present to be at higher risk, those who are involved in those sports?
Yeah, for sure. So when we're looking at sports that emphasize appearance, weight requirements, or have weight classes, or really look at, again, form and appearance as a part of the judging, we're talking about sports that include but are not limited to things such as gymnastics, figure skating, swimming and diving can also be one of those sports where, again, form is emphasized. And then as well as wrestling, where you have the different weight classes and you have to make a certain weight to be able to compete in a certain category. I also want to add that endurance sports, such as track and field, again, cross country, and again, swim and dive, those sports that really emphasize having a leaner musculature can definitely contribute to some of those body image concerns and disordered eating. And then along the lines of endurance sports, you also have running, which I already mentioned, swimming, which I've already mentioned, and then soccer, right? Again, where you typically have athletes, or the prototypical athlete is naturally slender, has a leaner build, and that's kind of identified as the prototype, what you should be striving for. So I would definitely say those are some specific sports. There's a lot of overlap, but when you mention revealing uniforms, I actually had the privilege of working underneath my academic advisor in grad school, and he conducted a study that was exclusively with volleyball players. Now, I know these findings have been replicated with other sports as well, but for the volleyball players who participated in this study, these are female-identified volleyball players. And they mentioned just some self-consciousness around their uniforms, definitely acknowledged how it impacted their performance on the court, but also, experiencing some discomfort even off the court, having to, mentally prepare to go into a game knowing that they were going to be wearing some revealing uniforms, and that having an indirect impact on how they felt, how they played, how they performed.
Wow, that's super interesting. It just made me think that there's so much pressure in playing a sport and performing your best, but then there's this other layer that we might not often think about, that there are spectators there too, watching, and there's perhaps more eyes on these students in playing these sports of what their bodies might be looking like. And then add the layer of different uniforms that they have can increase that maybe self-consciousness of how one's body presents in those moments of performing.
Exactly. I would just add, like, external perception definitely plays a role for student athletes, because as you mentioned, Rachel, they are on quote unquote display. And even though their athletic talents and abilities are what we're really looking at and observing as spectators, acknowledging that that's not what the brain separates or perceives in the moment. So really wanting to draw attention to, the social component of body image concerns and disordered eating for student athletes.
Yeah, definitely. You also mentioned that it stuck out to me when you said soccer players and other endurance sports, is like the image of who those athletes are is that they're slender and fit. And so it just made me think of these messages that athletes receive about, how they should look within their sport culture, such as a soccer player, and then and how they might be perceived outside of that sport based
Mhm.
on other intersecting identities they hold, and how there could be contradictions there that could increase their body concerns depending on the environment they're in.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. On that point, Rachel, I will say that female identified athletes, um, I'd say more so than male athletes, and we can definitely dive deeper into this difference. Um, but they often experience those mixed messages. When an individual attributes their physical performance, elite physical performance, to being at a lower weight, being skinnier, being thinner, oftentimes that's the rub where you have, yeah, that's the rub where someone kind of starts to exhibit some signs of having body image concerns or being more worried about losing weight to improve performance as opposed to really fueling their bodies properly. But when you talk about the mixed messages and contradictions that can definitely surface, I would say for female identified student athletes, that is particularly true because, again, you have this pursuit within sport to be muscular, to be fit, to be strong so that you can perform well. And then off the court or off the field of competition, you have society's messages of what is the ideal. So I think about the thin ideal, where leaner, thinner, thinner musculature is definitely valued. I would definitely say, it's again that rub of wanting to be muscular and fit within your sport so that you can perform well, and then being too muscular off the field of competition, and that definitely creates, as you can imagine, some cognitive dissonance, but also some internal dissatisfaction with how you're presenting, and your body as it
Mm-hmm.
naturally is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned it about maybe more often occurring among female athletes. And I,
Mhm.
as a female myself, I can definitely see that being uh, like in contradiction maybe to messages that women, particularly I'm thinking white women, like really internalize of being thin, and maybe saying like you don't want to be that muscular. So how
Mhm.
that might impact them off the sport arena. I was going to say field, but that doesn't apply to all sports. and
Yeah, all
and
good.
just how that added pressure could really impact someone.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I love that you mentioned just the intersection of race because it's also making me think just about, yeah, culturally, how some of the messages that we can receive about our bodies, even as female identified women, can be very different, right? So I wanted to speak to, yeah, just the intersection of race, because I definitely think from a cultural perspective, there can be some different messages that are delivered in terms of, again, what it is to be beautiful and feminine, and then from white culture, and then what it is to be beautiful and feminine and maybe thin, maybe not as thin from a Black cultural perspective. I think it's important to identify that values are going to differ in terms of what is considered attractive, what is considered beautiful. But oftentimes you do have that, again, that tension that exists because muscularity among women, regardless of race, is never, I won't say is never perceived, but is often not perceived as the ideal when it comes to thinking about femininity and some of those feminine norms that we may ascribe to. Actually, again, from a research perspective, it was seen that female student athletes ascribe to a lot of masculine traits and characteristics as it relates to competition, risk taking, a lot of those attributes that are typically attributed to males or masculine norms. And again, off the field of competition, you have this societal rub that female athletes are often trying to reconcile on their
Hmm.
own.
Yeah, I really like that description of societal rub, like that there
Mhm.
being maybe some tension of how they themselves present of who they are, but also how others are perceiving them when they're being
Yeah.
themselves, and how those different identities, one of those identities being a student athlete, is impacting who they are and their behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it makes me think of the many ways that having body and eating concerns among student athletes could impact their mental and physical health. I think physically thinking about eating concerns really stands out to me. But are there things that stand out to you of how they could be impacting student athletes' experiences?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I'm right there with you in terms of, my mind immediately goes to mental health and how body image concerns, but also, as you mentioned, disordered eating can impact one's mental health. So I think about some of the, typical experiences that we see of college students who are presenting at the counseling center. Our top two would be folks who are struggling with anxiety and folks who are struggling with depression. But I want to acknowledge folks who are struggling with body image and do have some history of disordered eating behaviors. Another mental health component at a clinical level could be actually having a diagnosable eating disorder. And that's really important to pay attention to as it relates to one's physical health, because you also have other, manifestations of health complications. So when I think about someone who may have body image concerns, but is also struggling with an eating disorder, physically, you're seeing sleep disturbances. And we know sleep is so critical from a recovery and rehabilitation standpoint for student athletes, as well as just, normal human functioning. Folks can experience difficulties regulating their body temperature. Again, acknowledging that from a physical health standpoint, if you aren't nourishing and really fueling your body with the nutrients it needs, chances are there are going to be some deficits, and that can have lasting impacts. Similarly, heart complications. We have student athletes who are competing at very, very high levels, and they're using their body as a mechanism to do that. So anytime you're adjusting caloric intake, anytime you are, let's say, not having caloric intake, and again, not fueling your body with the nutrients it needs to do what it can naturally do, you run into some issues, and having heart complications with disordered eating is definitely one of those. Folks can also have experiences with GI problems, dehydration. Particularly with females, there is a lot of research on what used to be called the female athlete triad, where you have amenorrhea, so a loss of your period just because the body's fat content isn't high enough to sustain that natural process. You can have some folks who experience a loss of bone density or osteoporosis, where again, because you aren't having enough nutrients to fuel your body so that it can do what it needs to do, you actually start to experience some issues at the skeletal level. And for student athletes, that can also lead to the occurrence of stress fractures or other minor injuries that could turn into a bigger injury down the line. And then I also want to point out just damage to your vital organs and body parts. Again, disordered eating, depending on its severity, so I want to be sure I say that, can definitely have some detrimental effects. But with detection, with treatment, it's definitely something that, student athletes can work towards recovery and experience some success with treatment. So I want to be intentional with saying, like, it definitely depends on the severity or intensity of the disordered eating, but there are a host of physical and mental health complications associated with more severe presentations.
Yeah, they seem really important to mention as there are possibilities, and maybe as people are watching and they're saying, I have some of these concerns, the body and eating concerns, and maybe it's more important that I address them sooner so that these health concerns aren't something that I'm dealing with.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So it makes me, think, are there maybe suggestions or insights that you could provide for a student athlete who might be experiencing body and eating concerns, be able to differentiate between behaviors they're engaging in maybe for sport versus those that might be problematic for them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I hesitate, I pause, because student athletes tend to be very driven, very motivated, very passionate folks. And I don't say that just as to praise, sing their high praises, but just acknowledging because they do what they do, right? Again, completing a college career, working 2 full-time jobs while they do it, there is a passion behind it. So I want to be careful with distinguishing between passion and commitment and dedication to one sport. And again, some of those more problematic manifestations of body image concerns and disordered eating that can definitely arise. But when you're trying to make that distinction, I would go to, some of the, I guess, concerns that we just identified from a mental health perspective. If you are having any experiences with anxiety and or depression, and this can be outside of sport and outside of yourself, maybe this is more related to other things that are happening in life. It could be related to performance, or if it's anxiety and or depression that's more internal, right? Maybe, again, you're not appearing the way you want to appear. We have folks who claim that they feel fat despite overall fitness and visually presenting very thin. I would say any shift and anxiety and or depression symptoms definitely can be a sign that, hey, maybe this is a good point to get checked out or just to have a meeting with a counselor to see if there's anything else here. I also like to draw people's attention to excessive exercise. And I know this can be very subjective, but if you're thinking about excessive exercise, we're identifying anything that's over and above what your team is already doing. So think about those extra, I have student athletes who, do some extra hitting, let's say after baseball or softball practice. Maybe they get up some extra shots after basketball practice. That is okay. But if you find yourself doing full-fledged workouts multiple times a week after your team's workout, it's definitely a point where you can say, like, let me check in and see, am I trying to gain a competitive edge, or am I, really worried about how I look, how I appear, and how my physical being may be impacting my performance. Also along those lines, excessive use of the restroom. Some folks, particularly those who are managing body image concerns and, doing so with, I'll say, more maladaptive coping strategies, such as using laxatives or diet pills. Using excessive use of the restroom can be one of those signs of, hey, like, am I trying to drop weight? Am I, again, is this out of the norm, right? Is this behavior out of the norm? I would also say folks can experience some physical signs of their body image concerns manifesting, or disordered eating manifesting if they have any difficulty concentrating, right? Think of like a brain fog that's kind of coming over. That can definitely be a sign of some malnutrition, again, not giving your body the fuel it needs to do what it does properly. And then also, if a student athlete has any type of preoccupation with their weight or preoccupation with eating, and or an avoidance of eating and eating situations. I know for a lot of our team sports at Towson, team meals are a very frequent thing, right? You are on the road with your team, you eat with your team, you do everything with your team. So if you have someone who's kind of withdrawing, particularly around those eating events, maybe you don't see them taking in as much. Maybe you don't notice that they're hydrating and fueling their bodies. That can definitely be a sign that, hey, this might be a great opportunity to either help that person get connected with a mental health resource, or if that is you and you're experiencing that, definitely get connected and see if you can get some support around that.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and not just considerations for individuals to be having as student athletes, but also as people close to student athletes or a teammate or a coach or whoever it might be, to be on the lookout for maybe signs of people they care about that could use extra support.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So one thing I just wanted to throw in there is the consideration of the pandemic right now, and how that's impacted student athletes, I'm sure, in numerous ways. The way that stands out to me so much is that maybe not engaging in the sport as they normally would in terms of intensity or frequency if their season was canceled or altered in any way. Are there any ways that maybe the pandemic has increased or impacted body and eating concerns among student athletes from either your observations or maybe a hypothesis you might have?
Yeah, I can definitely answer this more from an experiential standpoint. I would say, quite honestly, I don't think anyone was prepared for how the pandemic was going to impact our normal way of living. And that's definitely true for student athletes. For some folks, you had individuals who were able to maintain access to playing spaces, practicing spaces, or resources that they needed to engage in their sport. So something very simple would be like a basketball player. They literally need a ball and then a hoop. That could be an outdoor court or an indoor court, but there's a lot more flexibility, for basketball than there is for, let's say, I don't know. Yeah, I guess for like swim and dive, where you actually need a pool. I know a lot of pools and recreation centers were closed down. So I point out that distinction. It probably wasn't the greatest distinction, but point out that distinction just to show that folks had differing levels of access to engage in their sport throughout the pandemic. So when our student athletes returned to campus, there was definitely a stratification of some folks who were still in great physical conditioning and had been able to engage in their sport. Definitely folks who, engage in those outdoor sports such as soccer, such as lacrosse, maybe are, folks who had access to venues where they could still engage and practice, coming in condition. And then you had some folks who didn't have access. Maybe they just didn't have an opportunity to engage in any type of practice, or they were just dealing with the stress of the pandemic in a different way. So you definitely had student athletes on the other end of the spectrum who had gained weight since leaving school, and had to come back and not only work on regaining their physical conditioning, maybe dropping some weight, but also the muscle decompensation that happens when you're not training your body in the same way that you would for a competition year.
Mm-hmm.
So I say all of that to say you had folks all across the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
I think one unifying thread that I would definitely identify as far as how the pandemic has impacted folks is this idea of seeking control. And I think, again, with all of the uncertainty that was caused by the pandemic, us not knowing how long it was going to last, what would be the lasting impacts, how long we would be going through, needing all of the safety protocols and whatnot. There is definitely a desire to seek more control. And I would say for folks who may have already been prone or at greater risk, or even struggling with body image concerns and disordered eating behaviors prior to the pandemic, some of that may have been exacerbated by the pandemic and that seeking and needing some type of control. When we think at a very biological level about eating and that process of selecting and being in control of what goes into our bodies, that's often the deeper manifestation of body image concerns and disordered eating is really being able to have full control over what you eat, what you intake, and how you feel. So I would just say for folks, the pandemic definitely shook up a lot. You had, student athletes, again, all the way across the spectrum. But I think from a general mental health standpoint, everyone is seeking control in domains of their lives, and eating and body image can definitely be one of those domains where they were seeking that control. And hopefully, now that folks have access to resources, they are utilizing them to support their needs, whatever they may be.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, no doubt student athletes have been impacted and in various ways. That's such a good consideration of control and how the pandemic took a lot of control from student athletes and how those who might have already been vulnerable to body and eating concerns could have been more vulnerable during this period.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't even mention, I think it was implicitly in there, but just the sedentary lifestyle that we've all, kind of shifted into has definitely played a role as well. But again, that was kind of more implicitly included.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Yeah, I saw that as an implicit message in there. But thanks for naming it for clarity. Yeah. So the last question I'm going to ask is, for student athletes who are struggling with body and eating concerns now, do you have any recommendations for them in terms of either seeking help or increasing their body acceptance?
Yeah, for sure. I think the first message that I want to share with folks, and this is not going to be anything that's groundbreaking or anything, but it's acknowledging that you are not alone in your pursuit of self-acceptance. And I truly, wholeheartedly believe that and mean that at its core. Like, you are not alone in your pursuit of self-acceptance. For student athletes, I want to acknowledge you are not alone in your experience of wanting to be an elite performer and wanting to look for ways to optimize your performance. But I want to assure you that lower weight or lower, when I think about BMI and some of those metrics that are used in sports spaces, a lower number on the scale and a lower, body fat ratio does not make you a great competitor, right? And similarly, folks who are thin, folks who do have those lower body weights, smaller body sizes, or even lower BMIs, they're not necessarily happy and on top of the world, right? So I throw these pieces out there, hoping that that's a point of reflection for folks, acknowledging to be thin is not to be happy, to be thin is not to be a great athlete, but it's really checking in with yourself, right? And on that note, in acknowledging that bodies come in a variety of sizes and shapes, that we all have different capacities and things that we can do with our bodies, really settling in and being able to celebrate and cherish what you're able to do with your body in its full functionality. I think it's important to note that, in our attempt, especially for student athletes, in their attempt to strive for mastery, right? Strive for being the best. There can often be this discount of what you can do or what you've already done. And I think this is a great point for reflection for student athletes, definitely, to be able to say, like, let me actually take a look at what this last year has been like for me, because I think anyone who is, in a place where they are thriving and doing well, definitely had to overcome a lot over this past year, right? So just being able to take this as a moment to reflect. But again, take this as a moment to celebrate what you've been able to navigate over the past year, but certainly what you're still able to do with your body, and focusing on functionality as opposed to weight or my body size, I think is a much healthier place to have your mind be set. Because again, it's focusing on what you can do. And if you're looking to do something, looking to grow in your skill set or expertise, that's great, right? But again, acknowledging that false equation of if I'm thin, then I'm going to be the best competitor isn't quite true, right? I would also encourage folks, in addition to doing that kind of reflection in the moment, it could also be really helpful to acknowledge that your weight fluctuates on a weekly and monthly basis. So just taking that regular fluctuation into account. I think that's helpful just for folks from a physiological standpoint. Your body weight is not going to be something that's constant. And if you are constantly monitoring it, it's going to change. So apologies for the noise in the background. I'd also like to encourage folks, while you're reflecting on the fact that everyone is different, everyone's body is different, and everyone's body can do different things, also start to engage in some self-reflection, more at an internal level. So when I say that, I'm speaking more specifically to your values, your emotions. I'm also thinking about other dimensions of wellness, so spiritual wellness, and how you want to grow and develop throughout your time as a college student, but also throughout your athletic career. When we're looking more internally at the things that we want to fix, or the areas that we want to grow in. It's really about that process of growth and development, which is a lifelong experience. So getting folks to channel more of that attention and energy inward, as opposed to what the physical exterior looks like. Yeah. And then lastly, I think this is something that was very evident from, just our conversation earlier in our body talk, but the idea that beauty is not this one set thing. And a lot of our ideals when it comes to what's attractive, what's in, what's the trend, are informed by culture, they're informed by fashion, but not necessarily by health. And I think that is of utmost importance. When we think about our student athletes and wanting them to function well in their multiple full-time jobs, it's acknowledging that to do the things they need to do, they have to be healthy. And if we're not prioritizing health, then there might be some other things that are going on that might be detrimental to one's overall well-being. So really wanting to prioritize health and acknowledge that those standards don't translate from a health perspective. So focusing on health, utilizing resources that are available to you. For my student athletes at Towson, definitely want to emphasize using the resources that are available. Team doctors, athletic trainers. We also have a sports nutritionist on staff. Use these folks, consult with these folks. If you are looking to lose weight, and that's something that is completely within your treatment plan and will keep you in healthy standing for your sport. There are ways to do that that don't involve, crash dieting, again, using maladaptive strategies such as laxatives. So just taking a very informed and measured approach, but using the resources you have at your disposal.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's also powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. Such a great point that people can have goals related to their body and weight and to execute them in a healthy way. And it sounds like student athletes at Towson have these resources available to them that they could utilize if they're having some of these concerns and they'd like some expert opinions on them to please utilize them.
Certainly, certainly. And I left off strength and conditioning coaches, but strength and conditioning coaches as well. I think that's one of the great benefits of being a student athlete is that, yes, you're working these 2 full-time jobs, but you also have access to amazing resources while you do that. So taking advantage of those things and not just, leaving them to chance or leaving them for other folks to utilize, but acknowledging you can use them too.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's such a great point, and such wonderful suggestions and advice to student athletes. So thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, Dr. David, excuse me. It's just been so wonderful to hear these insights and reflect on, like, from my personal perspective, really expanding my knowledge of the impact of student athletes as that intersects with body and eating concerns, but also hoping that this video, spreads awareness for other individuals as well, and maybe normalizes those who are experiencing these concerns, that they're not the only ones experiencing them as well. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate the opportunity. And yes, I'm definitely hoping that this talk was impactful. If nothing else, it got folks thinking, not only about student athletes and their experiences, but for student athletes out there. I'm hoping that this is a great, again, opportunity to check in with yourself and really see, am I navigating some of these challenges and can I utilize some of the resources that were discussed?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.